A federal judge is blocking the removal of a Palestinian activist from the U.S. Mahmoud Khalil was detained by ICE at Columbia University over the weekend. House Speaker Mike Johnson just spoke to reporters at the Capitol, reiterating the administration's message of zero tolerance for pro-terrorist activity.
If you are on a student visa and you're in America and you're an aspiring young terrorist who wants to prey upon your Jewish classmates, you're going home. We're going to arrest your tail and we're going to send you home where you belong. And this is just getting started.
But Khalil's attorney says he has a green card and tells ABC News Live, quote, he cannot be detained or removed in retaliation for constitutionally protected speech. Now the judge is weighing the petition challenging Khalil's arrest that sparked protests here in New York City. Let's bring in former acting director of ICE, John Sandweg, for more on this. John, thanks for coming on. You know, Khalil's attorney says he has a green card. He's here in the U.S. legally. So can he be detained for being part of these campus encampment protests?
Diane, I think the answer really is potentially. This is a very interesting legal case, setting aside all the policy issues that this case presents. So when you have a green card, you're entitled to remain in this country unless you know, a few triggering events. So in this case, what I expect ICE is going to argue is either one, that the statements or the work that Khalil did constituted material support for terrorism. The immigration laws do allow the government to deport a green card holder if the government can demonstrate that they've provided some sort of material support for a terrorist. They will have to prove that, though, to an immigration judge. But the second way, which I think might be going on here, is really interesting, which is that if the Secretary of State himself certifies that the person's presence in the United States is harmful to U.S. foreign policy, there is this very rarely used ground of deportability that technically allows the administration to deport a green card holder if the Secretary of State makes that certification. We haven't seen the legal documents, charging documents yet, and there's still a lot of questions, it sounds like, from his own lawyer about what ground ICE is asserting here. But I strongly suspect it'll probably be both of those grounds, a terrorism-related nexus, as well as some sort of certification from Secretary Rubio saying that his continued presence in the United States is harmful to the country.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about the terror part, because Khalil was the leader of Columbia's encampment movement. President Trump and Speaker Johnson seem to be calling him pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, linking him to Hamas. How much evidence do they have to provide for that in court?
Well, I think you nailed it, Diana. This thing goes right at the heart of the questions of what constitutes First Amendment protected speech that every person, immigrant or otherwise, in the United States has the right to make. And where do you cross that line into material support? So it's really going to boil down to the evidence. I will say this, that certainly there have been cases, and I was involved in cases during my time at DHS, where we brought removal cases against people for links to terrorism. But in those cases, almost always you have financial support or operational support. People who are actually involved in a dialogue with the terrorist organization, are raising money for the organization, or actually engaged in plots to harm U.S. citizens. We don't know all the evidence the government has, of course, in this case, but it sounds like the issue here is really his speech activities, his organizations of protests on campus. I think they're going to face some very steep and significant First Amendment challenges as this case winds its way through the courts. But Diane, I also think it's the kind of case that will be going through the courts for a long time.
John, Khalil set to appear in court tomorrow. What are you watching for there?
Well, I think there are two different pieces. That one is you have this injunction. So a federal court, there's a habeas petition that was filed, and the federal court's going to issue an injunction. I expect what the court is going to do is leave that injunction in place and say, let's let the process play out a bit in the immigration court. There's also going to be very quickly what's called a bond hearing, where Khalil is actually, his lawyers are going to ask the immigration judge, a different judge who's handling the deportation case, to release him from custody. I would suspect that if they're also going to ask the federal judge. So I think what I would say here is that there is going to be a lot of legally wrangling to play out in the coming weeks. But if the government is unable to present evidence that Khalil presents an active threat to the United States, I do think there's a good chance that he's going to be released from immigration custody. It doesn't mean that the deportation case is going to go away, but that he might be released from ICE detention as this case goes forward.
Former acting director of ICE, John Sandweg. We appreciate your time today, John. Thank you.
My pleasure.